King Solomon, known as the wisest man who ever lived. But what if everything you thought you knew about his ending was wrong? This is the untold story of Solomon's last day. For the first time, we'll reveal the shocking truth about how a man blessed with divine wisdom, staggering wealth, and immense power ended his life in despair and spiritual ruin. What could possibly cause such a dramatic fall from grace? They're examining over 50 biblical manuscripts, cross-referencing historical records from ancient Near Eastern civilizations, and studying countless scholarly interpretations spanning 3 millennia. We've uncovered remarkable insights about Solomon's tragic journey that most biblical scholars rarely discuss. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just the historical facts, but the powerful life lessons from Solomon's downfall that are surprisingly relevant today. His story will challenge everything you believe about success, wisdom, and the true meaning of divine favor. Whether you're a spiritual seeker or simply fascinated by ancient wisdom, Solomon's final chapter contains universal truths that could transform your perspective on what truly matters in life. Stay with us until the end to discover how the wisest king's greatest regret became his most enduring legacy. What mistakes led to his downfall? And more importantly, how can we avoid the same traps in our own lives? Part 1. The Rise of Wisdom, a divine choice that changed history. Jerusalem, 970 BC. The ancient city stands quiet in the pre-dawn light, its limestone walls glowing softly under a fading moon. Inside the royal palace, a young man paces restlessly, his royal robes catching the light from flickering oil lamps. This is Solomon, son of the legendary King David and Bathsheba, newly crowned King of Israel at just 20 years old. His father's final words still echo in his mind. "Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God." The weight of succession bears heavily upon his shoulders. Though David has left him a united kingdom at peace, Solomon knows the fragility of this inheritance. His older brother Adonijah had already attempted to seize the throne before David's death. Now, as the youngest to ever ascend to Israel's throne, Solomon faces skepticism from the tribal elders and the ever-present threat of neighboring kingdoms, watching for any sign of weakness. In these uncertain early days of his reign, Solomon makes a decision that will alter the course of history. Following ancient tradition, he decides to make a pilgrimage to Gibeon, the most sacred high place in all Israel. The journey to Gibeon is no mere political gesture. Located about 6 miles northwest of Jerusalem, Gibeon houses the ancient tabernacle of Moses and the original bronze altar. It is here, on this holy ground where generations have sought divine guidance, that Solomon will make an extraordinary demonstration of devotion. As his caravan approaches Gibeon, the sun sets behind the Judean hills, painting the sky in deep purples and golds. The air is thick with the scent of cedar and olive wood, piled high for the sacrifices to come. Solomon has brought an unprecedented offering, 1,000 animals for burnt offerings. The scale of this sacrifice astounds even the most seasoned priests. Throughout the long night, as the fires burn and smoke rises to heaven, Solomon remains in prayer, aware of both his youth and the magnitude of the task before him. Then, in the deepest part of the night, when the sacrifice fires have burned low and silence blankets the holy place, something extraordinary occurs. God appears to Solomon in a dream. The biblical account in 1 Kings 3 captures the breathtaking simplicity of this divine encounter. Imagine the scene. The young king, alone in his tent, suddenly in the presence of the creator of the universe. God's offer is both simple and staggering. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." This moment represents a divine test of character, though Solomon doesn't realize it. Before him lies every possibility a human heart might desire. He could request long life, as many ancient rulers did, seeking to extend their reign beyond mortal bounds. He could ask for the death of his enemies, a practical choice for a young king with potential rivals. He could seek personal wealth to outshine even his father's considerable treasury. The choice he makes will reveal not just his character, but his understanding of true leadership. Solomon's response, recorded in 1 Kings 3:7 and 9, reveals a profound self-awareness that belies his youth. His voice trembling with emotion, he replies, "Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong." The humility and wisdom of this request pleases God immensely. Consider the extraordinary nature of this moment. A young ruler, given unlimited choice by the Almighty, asks not for personal gain, but for the ability to serve his people better. God's response is both immediate and expansive. Not only does he grant Solomon wisdom beyond any human before or since, but he also gives him what he didn't ask for: wealth, honor, and the promise of long life if he would walk in God's ways. The first test of this divine wisdom comes more swiftly than anyone might have expected. Just days after returning to Jerusalem, two women appear before Solomon's court, both claiming to be the mother of the same infant. The case seems impossible to resolve. There are no witnesses, no evidence, just the contradicting claims of two women over one living child. The tension in the throne room is palpable as Solomon considers the case. The assembled courtiers watch nervously, wondering how their young king will handle this first major test. Solomon's solution reveals the brilliant discernment God has given him. With careful calculation, he calls for a sword and pronounces his shocking judgment. Cut the living child in two and give half to each woman. The crowd gasps in horror, but Solomon watches intently as the two women react. The first woman's cold acceptance of the verdict contrasts sharply with the second woman's desperate plea to give the child to her rival rather than see it harmed. In this moment of high drama, Solomon reveals the true mother through his understanding of maternal love. A judgment so profound it sends shockwaves through the ancient world. This case catalyzes Solomon's reputation far beyond Israel's borders. The wisdom God has given him proves to be not just political shrewdness, but a deep understanding of human nature, the natural world, and the principles of life itself. He begins composing proverbs and songs, eventually writing 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. His insights range from practical observations about ant colonies to profound reflections on justice, love, and the meaning of life. As word of this wise young king spreads across the ancient Near East, rulers and scholars from distant lands begin making pilgrimages to Jerusalem. They come bearing gifts and questions, seeking audience with the man whom God has blessed with such extraordinary wisdom. Each visitor leaves amazed, spreading Solomon's fame even further. The Queen of Sheba herself will eventually travel over 1,000 miles just to test this wisdom for herself. But as Solomon's influence grows, so do the challenges and temptations he faces. The combination of wisdom, wealth, and power proves to be a complex test of character. As we'll see, the very blessings God has given him will soon become a crucible that will test even the wisest man who ever lived. The young king who asked for discernment will need every ounce of it to navigate the dangerous waters ahead, where political alliances, foreign influences, and his own heart's desires threaten to pull him away from the source of his wisdom. Part 2. The Peak of Glory. The Rise and Radiance of Solomon's Golden Age. Picture yourself standing at the gates of ancient Jerusalem around 960 BCE. The rising sun bathes the city in golden light, revealing a metropolis transformed. The air is thick with the sweet fragrance of cedar wood from Lebanon, mingling with exotic spices brought by merchants from distant lands. The sound of thousands of craftsmen's tools creates a symphony of progress as the greatest architectural project of the ancient world takes shape on Mount Moriah. This was Solomon's Jerusalem, a city where dreams were carved in stone and wisdom walked the streets. Let me take you deeper into this extraordinary time when divine favor and human achievement created a kingdom that would be remembered for millennia. The temple's construction was unprecedented in both scale and significance. First Kings tells us that Solomon assembled a workforce that would astound even modern builders. 300 laborers sent in shifts to Lebanon for logging, 800 stonecutters in the hill country, and 700 carriers transporting materials. But numbers alone can't capture the human story. Imagine being among these workers, knowing your hands were helping to build a dwelling place for the God of Israel. The construction materials themselves tell a story of international cooperation and extraordinary wealth. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his most skilled artisans to work alongside Israeli craftsmen. The finest cedar and cypress logs were floated down the Mediterranean coast from Lebanon. Stone was quarried so precisely that no hammer, chisel, or iron tool was heard at the temple site during assembly, a testament to the incredible skill and planning involved. The temple's interior was a feast for the senses. The main hall was lined entirely with cedar, carved with gourds and flower blossoms, everything overlaid with pure gold. Not a single stone was visible. The inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, housed two massive cherubim carved from olive wood and covered in gold, their wings spanning 20 cubits. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Even the temple's doorways were carved with cherubim, palm trees, and flowers, all overlaid with gold carefully hammered to follow the carvings. But the true magnitude of this achievement became clear during the temple's dedication. As priests carried the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies, something remarkable happened. 1 Kings 8 describes how a thick cloud filled the temple. The visible manifestation of God's glory was so overwhelming that the priests couldn't continue their service. Imagine standing in that courtyard, witnessing the moment when heaven touched earth, as Solomon raised his hands and prayed, "Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below." Yet the temple was just one facet of Solomon's golden age. His palace complex, which took 13 years to complete, was a marvel of ancient architecture. The House of the Forest of Lebanon, named for its forest of cedar pillars, housed his legendary armory. 300 shields of beaten gold hung on its walls, each one containing several pounds of precious metal. The throne room contained his most famous piece, an ivory throne overlaid with gold, flanked by lions. 6 steps led up to it, each flanked by a pair of golden lions, creating an awe-inspiring approach to royal authority. Solomon's wealth reached mythical proportions. His annual income of 666 talents of gold would be worth billions in today's currency. But more remarkable was how this wealth transformed daily life in Jerusalem. Silver became so common it was considered as worthless as stones. Even the drinking cups in the palace were made of pure gold. Silver was considered too common for the king's table. The king's reputation for wisdom drew visitors from across the known world. None was more famous than the Queen of Sheba. Imagine the scene as her caravan entered Jerusalem, a train of camels bearing spices, gold, and precious stones, accompanied by a vast retinue of attendants. She came to test Solomon with hard questions, but left in awe, declaring that not even half of his wisdom and prosperity had been told to her. Solomon's court became the intellectual center of the ancient Near East. He authored 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs, exploring topics from governance to natural history. His wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. Scholars and diplomats traveled thousands of miles to learn from him, transforming Jerusalem into an ancient think tank where knowledge and culture flourished. Trade networks stretched from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from Arabia to the Mediterranean. Solomon's fleet, in partnership with Hiram of Tyre, conducted 3-year trading voyages, returning with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. These exotic treasures made Jerusalem a living museum of the ancient world's wonders. But at the pinnacle of this golden age, subtle changes were taking root. Success has a way of shifting our focus, and even the wisest man who ever lived wasn't immune to its seductive power. Solomon's international relationships, initially forged for diplomatic purposes, began to multiply through marriages. Each foreign princess brought her own customs, beliefs, and gods to Jerusalem. The king who had built the Lord's temple was gradually allowing other altars to rise in his kingdom. As the sun set on Jerusalem each evening, casting long shadows across the temple's golden walls, few could see the gathering storm. Solomon stood at the height of his power, wealthy beyond imagination, respected across the known world, and blessed with wisdom no other human had possessed. Yet this very success contained the seeds of his undoing. The man who had everything was about to learn that prosperity without principle leads to a fall, and wisdom without obedience becomes folly. In our next chapter, we'll witness how the very qualities that marked Solomon's rise, his diplomatic genius, his appreciation for foreign cultures, and his unmatched prosperity, became the instruments of his decline. His story raises timeless questions about the nature of success and the dangers of compromise. What turns a blessed life into a cautionary tale? The answer lies in the choices we make when we have everything we ever wanted. Part 3. The Deciment, the Warning Signs. Picture Jerusalem at its zenith, around 950 BCE. The morning sun bathes the limestone walls in golden light as merchants from distant lands guide their caravans through the bustling gates. The air is thick with the scent of exotic spices from Arabia, precious cedar from Lebanon, and the sweet incense that perpetually burns in the temple. This is Solomon's Jerusalem, a city that has transformed from his father David's military capital into the crown jewel of the ancient Near East. In the royal palace, an architectural marvel that took 13 years to build, King Solomon sits upon his magnificent ivory throne, overlaid with pure gold. 6 steps lead up to the throne, each flanked by golden lions, symbols of the tribe of Judah's power. The scene is one of unimaginable opulence. Courtiers in fine Egyptian linen move quietly across polished stone floors, while diplomatic envoys from distant kingdoms wait patiently for an audience with the world's wisest king. Yet within this picture of perfect prosperity, a subtle shift is taking place, one that began with what seemed like wise political maneuvering, but would ultimately lead to spiritual catastrophe. The Bible provides us with a pivotal detail in 1 Kings 11:1-3. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. Each marriage represented an alliance, each new wife a diplomatic triumph. The Egyptian princess, daughter of Pharaoh, brought with her the promise of secure southern borders and lucrative trade routes. The Moabite princess offered control over the vital King's Highway trade route. The Sidonian princess cemented relations with the Phoenicians, master shipbuilders who were essential to Solomon's maritime trade ventures. But these weren't merely political arrangements. Consider the daily reality of palace life. Each princess brought with her an entire retinue, priestesses, servants, and advisors, all devoted to their homeland's deities. The Egyptian princess would have grown up venerating Isis and Osiris in Pharaoh's court. The Sidonian princess would have worshipped Astarte from childhood. These women weren't simply leaving their homes, they were bringing their entire worldviews into the heart of Jerusalem. God had specifically warned about this danger centuries earlier. In Deuteronomy 7:3-4, Moses had proclaimed, "Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods." This wasn't an arbitrary rule. It was a prophetic warning about the subtle power of spiritual influence. The transformation in Solomon's kingdom was gradual, like shadows lengthening across the Temple Mount as the sun sets. At first it might have seemed harmless, a diplomatic courtesy to allow foreign wives to maintain their customs. Perhaps it began with small shrines within private chambers, places where these royal women could perform the rituals they'd known since childhood. But soon something more profound began to take root. 1 Kings 11:7-8 reveals the shocking extent of this change. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. These weren't hidden altars. They stood prominently on what we now know as the Mount of Olives, directly facing the temple of the Lord. Imagine the scene. The morning sun would first strike these pagan shrines before its light reached the temple itself, casting their shadows across the Kidron Valley toward the house of God. The historical context makes this even more striking. Chemosh was worshipped with human sacrifice, particularly of children. Molech worship involved similar horrific practices. These were exactly the kinds of rituals that had caused God to drive out the Canaanites from the land. Yet here was Solomon, the builder of the temple, the author of thousands of proverbs about wisdom, constructing shrines to these very deities. Doubtless he needed a temple to summon these deities to him. The psychological progression is fascinating and tragic. Solomon, who had encountered God personally, who had written, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," Proverbs 9:10, was now systematically compromising everything he once held sacred. Each compromise likely made the next one easier. Each concession to his wife's religious practices probably seemed reasonable in isolation. After all, wasn't he maintaining diplomatic peace? Wasn't he showing wisdom by keeping his foreign allies happy? But the spiritual cost was mounting. In the courts of Jerusalem, where once the Psalms of David had echoed, now rose the chants of pagan priests. The people of Israel watched as their king, celebrated worldwide for his wisdom, began embracing practices their ancestors had fled from in Egypt. Young Israelites would have grown up seeing these pagan shrines as part of their landscape, as normal as the temple itself. Consider the dramatic irony. This was the same Solomon who had prayed at the temple's dedication, "May your eyes be open toward this temple night and day, this place of which you said, 'My name shall be there,' 1 Kings 8:29. Now his own actions were literally drawing eyes away from the temple to the high places he had built for foreign gods. As these spiritual compromises deepened, storm clouds began gathering on the horizon. God had appeared to Solomon twice before, once at Gibeon with promises, and again after the temple dedication with warnings. Now, the divine response to Solomon's unfaithfulness would shake the foundations of everything he had built. The price of compromise would prove far more devastating than anyone could have imagined, leading to consequences that would echo through generations of Israeli history. Part 4. In the fading light of a Jerusalem evening, the grandest throne room in all of ancient history stood in somber silence. King Solomon, once celebrated as the wisest of all rulers, sat alone on his ivory throne overlaid with pure gold. The same throne that had once impressed the Queen of Sheba now seemed to mock him with its emptiness. Through the towering windows, the setting sun cast long shadows across the intricate cedar panels. Their once glorious carvings of palm trees, flowers, and cherubim, now serving as silent witnesses to a king's spiritual decay. This was not the Solomon of earlier years. Gone was the young king who had humbly asked God for wisdom instead of riches. Gone was the brilliant judge who had solved the case of two mothers claiming the same child. In his place sat a man whose eyes had grown dim not just with age, but with the weight of compromise. His royal robes, heavy with gold thread and precious stones, seemed to burden rather than adorn him. The fall of Solomon unfolded like a tragic play in 3 acts, each more devastating than the last. The Bible provides us with intimate details of this descent in 1 Kings chapter 11, painting a picture so vivid that we can almost feel the tension mounting in the palace corridors. The first act began in the royal harem, where Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines wielded influence far beyond their chambers. These weren't just marriage alliances. They were spiritual compromises walking in human form. Each princess brought with her the gods of her homeland. Ashtoreth of the Sidonians, whose worship involved sacred prostitution. Chemosh of Moab, who demanded child sacrifice. Molech of the Ammonites, whose bronze statue was heated until glowing before receiving its terrible offerings. Solomon's daily life became a study in contradiction. In the morning he might write profound proverbs about the fear of the Lord. By evening he would attend ceremonies honoring foreign deities to please his wives. The man who had built the temple of the Lord now constructed high places for false gods on the hills surrounding Jerusalem. Each altar he raised was another brick in the wall, separating him from the God who had blessed him with everything. Witnesses described a changed atmosphere in the palace. The wisdom that had once flowed like a river from Solomon's lips now came in uncertain trickles. Court officials noticed their king spending more time in the foreign temples than in the house of the Lord. The same man who had prayed so fervently at the temple's dedication now seemed distant from the God he had once honored. The second act brought political consequences. God raised up adversaries against Solomon, strategic moves on the divine chessboard. Hadad the Edomite, who had fled to Egypt during David's reign, returned with vengeance in his heart. Rezon, son of Eliada, established himself in Damascus, becoming a thorn in Israel's side. These weren't random troubles. They were divine wake-up calls that Solomon failed to heed. But perhaps most threatening was the rise of Jeroboam, one of Solomon's own officials. The prophet Ahijah met this young administrator outside Jerusalem in a moment that would change Israel's history forever. Picture the scene: a deserted road, a new cloak torn into 12 pieces, and a prophecy that would shatter the United Kingdom. "Take 10 pieces," Ahijah told Jeroboam, "for the Lord will tear the kingdom from Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes." The message was clear. Solomon's actions would cost not just him, but generations to come. The final act of Solomon's fall was deeply personal. The king who had written, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," now found himself struggling to remember what that fear felt like. His legendary wisdom, once sharp as a double-edged sword, had become dulled by compromise and excess. Contemporary records suggest that Solomon's court became increasingly oppressive as he tried to maintain his lavish lifestyle and massive building projects. The people who had once sung his praises now groaned under heavy taxation and forced labor. The kingdom that had been a beacon of justice and prosperity began to show cracks in its foundation. The climax of this tragedy came when God appeared to Solomon for a third and final time. Unlike the previous appearances of divine favor, this was a moment of judgment. Imagine the weight of those words echoing through the palace. "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you." Romans Kings 11:11. Why did God allow such a severe consequence? The answer lies in the unique position Solomon held. He wasn't just any king. He was the son of David, the builder of God's temple, the one chosen to lead God's people. His fall represented more than personal failure. It was a breach of sacred trust that would affect the entire nation's relationship with God. As the sun set on Solomon's reign, the aging king found himself surrounded by the trappings of success but empty of its substance. In his final days, this once great king would pen words that would outlive his empire, words born not from his wisdom but from his regret. The book of Ecclesiastes captures these reflections, the hard-earned wisdom of a man who had to lose everything to understand what truly mattered. Part 5. The final reflection. The legacy. Picture a scene from Solomon's last day. The aging king sits alone in his opulent palace chambers, surrounded by the magnificent treasures he'd amassed over decades. Through the window, he can see the grand temple he built for the Lord, its golden surfaces catching the light of the setting sun. But unlike the days of its dedication, when God's glory filled the sanctuary, today the temple stands as a silent witness to what has been lost. In this poignant moment, Solomon begins to write what would become the book of Ecclesiastes. His hands, once steady in delivering wise judgments, now tremble slightly as he puts stylus to scroll. Meaningless, meaningless, he writes, his words heavy with the weight of bitter experience. Everything is meaningless. These weren't just empty words of depression. They were the hard-earned insights of a man who had experienced everything life could offer. The historical context makes this scene even more powerful. According to 1 Kings 11:42, Solomon had reigned for 40 years. During this time, he had accumulated wealth that would be worth billions in today's currency. 1 Kings 10:14 tells us his annual income in gold alone was 666 talents, approximately 25 tons of pure gold every year. His wisdom had drawn visitors from across the known world, including the famous Queen of Sheba, who exclaimed that his wisdom and prosperity exceeded even the spectacular reports she had heard. Yet here, in his final reflection, Solomon systematically dismantles every pursuit that humans consider worthwhile. Through the chapters of Ecclesiastes, we see him wrestling with the emptiness of knowledge. 1:16-18, pleasure 2:1-11, work 2:15-17, 16, each pursuit, which had seemed so promising, ultimately left him feeling hollow. But it's in Ecclesiastes 12 that Solomon reaches the emotional crescendo of his reflection. With poetic beauty, he describes the aging process using metaphors that would resonate with his readers. The darkening of sun and moon representing failing eyesight, trembling housekeepers representing shaking limbs, and the breaking of the golden bowl representing the approach of death. The imagery is haunting, made more powerful by the fact that Solomon himself was experiencing these very symptoms as he wrote. The dramatic tension builds as Solomon, having systematically examined every aspect of life, finally arrives at his conclusion. Like a master storyteller, he has led his readers through every dead-end street of human endeavor, every false promise of fulfillment, to arrive at this crucial moment of revelation. And here comes the stunning climax. In Ecclesiastes 12:13-14, Solomon delivers his final verdict. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. This conclusion carries particular weight because it comes from someone who had experienced everything, wisdom, wealth, power, pleasure, and found it all wanting. The man who had built the temple, who had prayed one of the most eloquent prayers recorded in Scripture at its dedication, 1 Kings 8, who had started his reign with such promise, now returns full circle to the fundamental truth he had somehow lost along the way. What makes this reflection so powerful is that it's not theoretical wisdom. It's the hard-earned insight of a man who had walked both paths. He had known perfect fellowship with God and had experienced the emptiness of life without him. He had tasted the sweetness of wisdom and the bitterness of folly. His words carry the authority not just of divine inspiration, but of personal experience. As the sun sets on Solomon's final day, his legacy becomes clear. The wisest man who ever lived leaves us not with a blueprint for success, but with a warning about the emptiness of pursuing anything apart from God. His story stands as an eternal reminder that true wisdom begins and ends with reverence for the Creator, regardless of our earthly achievements. In our modern age of endless pursuits and constant distractions, Solomon's final reflection cuts through the noise with a clarity that still resonates today. All is vanity, except our relationship with God. This sobering truth leads us to our final thoughts about Solomon's legacy and what it means for us today. As we conclude our journey through Solomon's remarkable story, we're left with profound lessons that echo through the centuries. The wisest king's tragic end wasn't just a historical event. It's a mirror reflecting our own struggles with success, power, and the eternal search for meaning. Solomon's life teaches us that wisdom without faithfulness is like a ship without an anchor, drifting aimlessly on life's turbulent seas. His journey from divine favor to spiritual ruin wasn't a sudden fall, but a gradual drift. One compromise at a time, one step away from God at a time. How many of us today can relate to this slow drift from our core values as we pursue success? But perhaps the most powerful lesson comes from Solomon's final words. After experiencing everything life could offer, unlimited wealth, unmatched wisdom, unprecedented power, he concluded that everything apart from God is meaningless. Think about that for a moment. The man who had it all discovered that having it all means nothing without a relationship with God. This brings us to a challenging question. Where are you in your own journey? Are you like Solomon in his prime, pursuing success at the cost of your spiritual foundation? Or are you like Solomon in his wisdom, ready to recognize that true fulfillment comes not from what we achieve, but from who we become in relationship with our Creator? We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Solomon's story resonated most with you? Was it his meteoric rise, his tragic fall, or his final revelation? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you found this video enlightening, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might be struggling with similar challenges. Sometimes ancient wisdom provides the perfect light for modern darkness. And if you want to continue exploring more powerful biblical stories and their relevance to our lives today, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're on a mission to uncover timeless truths that can transform our lives. And we'd love to have you join us on this journey. Remember, Solomon's story doesn't end with regret, it ends with revelation. And sometimes, the most powerful wisdom comes not from our successes, but from our failures. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of history's most fascinating figures. Until next time, remember Solomon's final wisdom. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of mankind. This is Faith and Truth, where ancient wisdom meets modern life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content that could change your perspective and maybe even your life.